I love therapy, and in fact, I've been going to therapy since I was around 6 years old. Though I talk about therapy a lot and may interview some therapists on the show on occasion, nothing that is said in this podcast should be considered a replacement for therapy. If you are struggling, I urge you to please seek guidance from a therapist because you are absolutely worth it. Hello, everyone. You are listening to Wine, Dine, and 69, a podcast about dating, relationships, sex, and self-love. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is staying safe. And we're almost 2 years into coronavirus at this point. It's pretty wild. So today's an interesting episode. It's interesting because I actually slated this episode for this date prior to anything in my personal life happening. But today's episode is about grief and relationships ending, grief when a partner dies in a relationship. I'm going through a breakup, y'all. I'm going through a breakup, and I have been for the last month. And I didn't want to mention it because I didn't want to mention it at the time because I felt that if I wasn't able to speak about it in a very matter-of-fact way, then it wasn't worth speaking about. But I am, and it sucks, and I really care about my former partner a lot, and I respect, it was his decision, and I respect his decision. And I'm trying to take it as an opportunity to look within and figure out what I want to change about myself, what I want to change about myself going forward in relationships, and what I'm looking for in the long term. So it's been an interesting few weeks, and it's been odd to be recording this podcast and record these intros and to not speak about it. It just felt slightly dishonest, but it just it hasn't felt right to talk about it until now. So yeah, it's tough. It's a big shift. My kind of future as I saw it has kind of shifted on a dime. But I'm doing okay. I really am. I'm more than okay, actually. I'm feeling really strong and centered and in control of my life. So it's so funny. And I think that I talked with in the Are You Happy bonus episode about how interesting it is when you're in really dark periods of your life that you're almost forced to see the light. And that's kind of how I feel right now. I feel like I have no choice but to be present. I feel like I have no choice but to live every moment as it is. So it's been a really big learning experience. And you know what? In all honesty, I'm grateful for it. I'm learning a lot about myself, and I'm learning to love myself even deeper. I think that I always have been really focused on self-love, but there's nothing like kind of having your world shaken under you that reminds you how important that is. So I'm okay. I'm hanging in there. It's every day is a little bit of a different journey. But yeah, I did want to come out and talk about that. At some point, the breakup occurred in early September. So, it's been about a month. And I needed to let things settle a little bit in my own personal life before speaking about it. But it almost feels right that I'm going to be in a conversation with Angel, my guest today, about grief and relationships, about grief when mourning a breakup, grief when you've lost a partner, and grief in all sorts and kinds. It's an incredible group that he has set up, and you can check out all of those links in the show notes. And I completely recommend it. Listening back to this episode, which I recorded a number of months ago, actually, was incredibly cathartic. So it feels right that I'm giving you this information in this episode. I do have a large backlog of episodes recorded. And so there are going to be a number of episodes where you hear me refer to my partner. And, just so you know, they're no longer my partner. And that doesn't mean that I have any less love or respect for them. It just means that for whatever reason, at this time, it wasn't working. So, just know that in the episodes coming forth the rest of 2021 and early into 2022, I may talk about, my partner and it's going to be kind of painful, I guess, to publish those episodes. But you know what? The fact of the matter is the guests and their stories are still worth telling. And that's what matters at the end of the day. So, I'm going through it. I'm learning a lot about myself. I'm learning a lot about the world, and I don't know, I'm learning a lot about everything. It's funny how when you're going through kind of a shitty situation, you are given a piece almost. It's like a permission slip to just go day to day. And that's something that I needed to learn. And so as much as it sucks to be learning it now, it's a blessing, and I'm trying to look at it as such. There are a ton of things on the horizon in my personal and professional life that I'm super excited about, and I'm pushing forward on all of those. So life is good. Life is really good. And it's funny how in moments of negativity, you can realize how good your life actually is. So that's me being as vulnerable as I'm comfortable being at this time on the air. Thank you for listening. Thank you for standing witness to my story, but also the stories of all of my guests. It's been a really incredible experience, and I look forward to sharing the rest of the episodes going forward. And hey, so today's episode, I kind of already touched on it, but today's episode is with Angel. And we're going to talk about grief in relationships, whether that be the loss of a partner, whether that be a breakup. And I also got a little bit vulnerable, not just in the intro, but in the interview itself, where, I talk about my mother's cancer diagnosis and how can you support someone who's facing that? And, that's kind of different from what Angel does, and he says as much, but there's just a lot of vulnerability happening right now. Not sure if it's in the stars, the planets, whatever. But that's where we're at. And I'm super honored to share this episode with you, with Angel. And thank you for, again, standing witness to me, to the guests, to the stories. Because ultimately that's what this is about, right? It's about the stories. So without further ado, I am going to cut to a quick commercial break, and then you will hear my conversation with Angel.
Hey there, I'm Megan Martin, and I put the manic in Manic Pixie Dream Girl.
And I'm Janelle Megan, and I'm a self-proclaimed Bond girl, and I make every conversation way too deep.
We're both professional actors, producers, and models.
Cause and Creation is a podcast where we talk about all things creative, including interviewing other awesome artists that are breaking new ground.
We'll be taking a deep dive into who they are, the work they do, and more importantly, what moves them as artists.
You'll get an inside look into the minds of award-winning filmmakers who are promoting new content, writers who are on the first draft of their novel, video game designers who are creating a whole new world from scratch, and so much more.
If you want to get to know creative, or just want to get to know us, come hang out with us at Cause and Creation every other Thursday.
Cue the applause.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am here today with my guest, Angel, and we're here to talk about a pretty serious topic today. Tell me, we're here to talk about grief. Angel, tell me a little bit about you and how you got interested in working in this area.
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, I started this organization called GriefX. And the reason why I got involved with it is it's going to be almost 4 years now. I lost my cousin to suicide.
Oh gosh.
And he was like a brother figure to me. And, I've had losses prior to him, but that was like the first time that like grief really impacted me, when it comes to loss. And it took me about a year to realize that it was having like a negative impact on my life. Yeah. And so eventually I went to a therapist, like for the first time in my life. And the therapist had recommended to, seek out a support group. And while looking for one, I had trouble finding one that, fit my schedule. And then others, they wanted you to commit to like a series. It wasn't like drop-in. So that was problematic. And I kept, searching and searching. And eventually I found the company that offered like grief training for like in the medical setting for like hospitals and things like that. So I reached out to them and I said, hey, like, is it all right if I took the course, I'll pay the fee or whatever. And they said, yeah, fine. So I took that course, and then that led me to discover that, like, our society isn't doing a good job at addressing the issue. And basically from there, and I did some other stuff, and then I decided that, like, let me try hosting my own support group, and that's kind of how we got started.
That's amazing. So is it something you do full time then?
No, not right now. I just do it on the side.
Got it.
Yeah, right now we're doing. We try to do at least 3 meetings a month, and that's kind of where we're at right now.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think grief is such a odd topic, and all of us are going to experience it in one way or another in our life. And so it's interesting that we don't talk about it so much, but there are lots of dark things in this world, and people that can make people uncomfortable. They shy away from it. So, well, how did it kind of get started? Like, how do you start a company or an organization? And, that from the ground level, you have this idea, you want to execute it. How did you start?
Yeah, so I was, so what I kind of use as a framework is, when it comes to support groups, I think in the substance realm, there's some pretty good organizations such as like AA. Another one is called Smart Recovery. So I'm familiar with both of those. So I kind of took like the aspects that I liked from both, and then using that as like the framework, as well as, what I learned in the training, kind of like form my own thing. So basically, I really like what I liked about AA was like the community aspect, and just like the fact that, they do a pretty good job at creating a safe space for people to, talk about their issue. Right. And I think with grief, that kind of, that model works pretty well, because, ultimately with what I found with grief is that it's a very individual journey. Right.
Right.
And what I help people do is like, I'm not a grief expert in their own grief. I'm only an expert in how I deal with my own grief. But what I help people do is basically, try to become a grief expert for their own problems, right? Because only they will know like what is helpful, what's not. And it's a process of discovery. But in order to get there, like, you have to be comfortable with your grief. And while certain things help certain people, and they may not be as effective for others, I've discovered that talking about your grief is definitely something that's helpful for everyone, right? So that's kind of like the basic principle, is that at least like, maybe some of the advice that we give in the meeting might not be helpful to you, but at least, you talking about it will be helpful. And so that's kind of like our motto there. Yeah.
And even if some of the advice doesn't fit for that particular person, it might give them some creative ideas for things that might actually work for them. So it's a jumping off point. I mean, when you deal with loss, you don't even know where to start sifting through those complicated emotions. So even just giving people a starting place,
right,
is really helpful.
Yeah,
that's really
and it also helps you, like, when dealing with someone else also, right? Because it makes you more aware of like, okay, well, maybe, like, say in the future you have someone that's going through it. So you can try to use some of these suggestions to see if that helps them.
Absolutely. And there are different types of grief. So you primarily deal with grief in the terms of loss of a life, correct?
Yeah, so I would say like 80% of the people that attend our meetings have lost someone due to death, but another 20% it's like breakups or divorces that, are not related to death.
Sure. Yeah. But I mean, I want to ask about both of those things. So I guess, how is it different? I mean, obviously loss of a life is different from a breakup or a divorce. And in the latter situation, like the other person is still alive. But the grief is different. Like how do they differ? How does the advice differ?
Right. So what I would say is like the main difference is that when it's related to a death, like, it's a lot harder. Well, I wouldn't say necessarily harder, but it's addressing it is it's much different in the sense that, like, there is like literally no contact with that person, right? Whereas if they're still alive, so like say in the context of a breakup or a divorce, like your former partner is still alive, right? Or even in some cases, some people they come because they're having some issues with their family, right? Like
Right.
maybe so in those cases, like those relatives are still alive, right? So there is some opportunity to reconnect, or in some cases, it's best to stay away from them. But that also has implications that you normally wouldn't deal with if they have passed on. So in the case of a former partner, like depending on how the relationship ended and how they took it, like you might still have to deal with that person trying to reach out to you, or them potentially harming you if it was that kind of a relationship.
Right. Right.
Whereas if they pass on, you're not dealing with that. But I mean, as far as like measuring the pain and stuff, I would say it's hard to quantify, right? And I would say also like one isn't necessarily better than the other, right? It's just different. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think that's true too. And you don't want to minimize anyone's grief. So just acknowledging that it's different is helpful. I wonder how the people who are experiencing grief, from loss of a relationship in some way, how they feel coming into a group that where the loss is so much different. And I hope that they don't compare and think, oh, well, my situation is so much less. Because I know that were I in that situation, I probably would.
Yeah. So that happens sometimes when people reach out in private and they're like, oh, I like they said, oh, I like the meeting, but I've kind of felt like uncomfortable talking about my own grief because, like, in the case of like you just mentioned, like say someone they just going through like a breakup, for example, right, versus people talking about that their partner actually died. So sometimes the first timers that are in this situation, like they might feel uncomfortable talking about their loss in the first meeting because they feel like, oh, like, these people, like their partner died, right? Mine is still alive. It just didn't work out. But I encourage them, just to share when they're ready, because ultimately, like it's still painful for you, right? And I think, as far as how other people take it too, I would say for the most part, like, everyone's understanding, like everyone acknowledges too that, at the end of the day, like grief is grief, loss is loss, right? Um,
Absolutely.
even when it comes to jobs too, like, say there's two types of people, like there's a person that was like, CEO of a company and, they're no longer that, versus someone that's working a minimum wage job. Like both of those people are going to feel pain when, they lose their income, right? Obviously, the person that's making a lot more money probably has better savings and stuff, but they still feel discomfort, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's just I do love that there's this like aura of understanding that you're describing. I think that's necessary and just important to create that safe space for people. Well, what are some of the tools that you use to walk through with people? What sort of advice do you give? And this can be both for, like, let's say you lose a partner, to death, or for a breakup, divorce, or even a job situation. What types of advice or tools do you offer the people who are going through this?
Yeah, so something that we talk about a lot are the five stages of grief. But the thing with that, though, is that we have to remember that the person that made that, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she actually, from my understanding, she made that for like people that were dealing with like a terminal illness, right?
Yes,
So it
yes.
wasn't really for like how to deal with when someone dies. But later it was like adapted into that. So another guy, David Kessler, he actually worked with her on something, and they and he published a book called the sixth stage of grief, which is finding meaning, right? And then I think he does a good job in that book about like tying all that together. But basically what I explain with that, though, is that, you know, from my experience and talking with other people, that the 5 stages of grief is not like a linear journey, right? So not everyone is going to experience all those emotions. Some people will skip some things entirely. And then even if you do reach acceptance or you find meaning, you can still like cycle through some of the other stages, right? And then sometimes it can hit you at once. And it can be like, you know, just randomly, you know, you find yourself in that situation again. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because a lot of people think that like, okay, like I'm going to go through this and then, you know, be done with it. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I literally just yesterday, I just moved and I've been going through some stuff, you know, trying to get rid of it. And I came across a stash of cards that my grandmother sent me from like every single holiday, for Thanksgiving, for Halloween. She died about 3 years ago. And it's crazy, just like how the smallest thing can just set you off. I just saw the card, saw her handwriting, and I lost it, and like dealt with, you know, all of these feelings all over again of, you know, just this loss. So it's, it really does hit you. And I think that's so important to let people know that these stages, you know, aren't linear. It's more of like a cycle, and you can go through it over and over and over again. And you probably will, you know, revisit multiple stages over the course of your life, because grief isn't something that ever goes away. You just become more comfortable with it.
Right. And I think like what you were describing also is something that we talk about too, which is called like a grief burst, which is, you know, something that kind of catches us off guard, and, you know, it just causes us to cycle through some of those stages. And then another thing that we also talk about too is like, for example, like there's like the things that kind of catch us off guard, right? Such as the grief burst. But then there are also other things that we can kind of like plan a little. So, you know, over time, you kind of like learn what your triggers are, right? And I find that like dates and certain holidays can be very triggering. So we can kind of like prepare. I mean, and of course too, like, you know, by prepare, I don't mean that like it's gonna be, you know, it's gonna work out 100%, but at least you can kind of like make arrangements and you know, consciously be aware that it's gonna be a difficult time for you.
Yeah, if you need to take the day off, you take the day off, right?
Right. So, you know, like preparing in that way can also be helpful. But ultimately, though, I think, again, you know, grief is a very individual journey. So I think, you know, we just also have to be comfortable in communicating our needs to other people as well, right? So for those of us that are fortunate enough to have a support system, sometimes, you know, people kind of like project their stuff on us. So, for example, like, you know, certain people prefer to be left alone. Other people prefer, you know, constant contact. So some people might reach out to us, you know, very frequently, right? Because that's what's helpful for them. But maybe we needed some space, right? So when this happens, you know, certain people get overwhelmed and they find it to have a negative impact. But, you know, they're scared to like confront the person about it, because they might think like, oh, you know, this person's gonna get mad at me because, you know, they're trying to help me out, and here I am telling them to leave me alone, right? But I think, you know, I think if the person really cares about you, like they'll be understanding, and as long as you approach it in a way where it's not offensive, you say, hey, look, like I know you're trying to cheer me up, but I kind of need some space right now. That's what would make me feel better. I would appreciate it if, you know, you give me you know, a couple of days or something, like, you know, whatever. You tell them what you need, and that would, or likewise too, if you feel that, you know, people are avoiding you, it might not be because it's, you know, like they dislike you or anything, or that they're scared of you now that you lost someone. It could just be that, you know, maybe they like to have some space, right? So they think that that works for you also, but maybe you want constant contact, or you would like them to check up on you. So again, don't be scared to reach out, because you know what, at the end of the day, what's the worst thing that could happen is that they react negatively to it. And if that's the case, then it's probably people that you don't want around in your life.
Exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that kind of like ties into a few questions that I had for you, which is about how can you support somebody who's going through grief, specifically, like how can a partner support their partner who's experienced grief? But really generally anyone, how can anyone be a support system? And it sounds like, I think this is the case with a lot of things in life, but asking what do you need is the number one thing.
Right. And also, as I think you mentioned earlier, sometimes you don't know what you need, right?
Yes.
And especially like when the grief is very fresh, like even though like you might have a general idea of what works for you or not, you might just be like in so much shock that, you really don't know what you want, right? So I would say, being a good listener is definitely, you can't go wrong with that, right? And I guess just, kind of use like your intuition based off what you know about the person, and, see what you might think might help them. And then also like, open up the dialogue, like, oh, do you want me to like, keep checking up on you, or do you prefer some space or something like that, right? At least that will make the person more comfortable in communicating their needs if what you're offering is not what they need. Right. So I think that's a good, safe approach to go by.
Yeah, no, that's all solid advice. I think it's tough. And again, this kind of leads me into my next question, which is, why do you think that grief and death are such taboo experiences? But it's true that like people just don't know what to do. And it's just kind of, they're like, very like, I don't know what to do. I mean, I've been guilty of that as well. Although, I do have a tendency to kind of lean into these tougher subjects just because that's life. But yeah, why do you think that people have such a hard time talking about these things?
Yeah, so I'll focus on each thing individually. So I think as far as like death is concerned, it's a scary thought,
Yeah.
And there's also like, there's still a lot of uncertainty about it, in the sense that like, we all know we're gonna die, right? And that's something that everyone accepts, or even if they don't want to accept it, like subconsciously they know that it's gonna happen, right? And every religion too like agrees on the fact that we're gonna die, and even if someone doesn't believe in any religion, they still agree that again, we're gonna die. So where it gets trickier is like, the whole thing about the purpose of life and the afterlife, and these things, like either make it more complicated, or in some cases add a layer of comfort for some people, right? But yeah, I think it's just like that uncertainty of behind it is what makes us uneasy. At least for me personally, like, doing this type of work has help me accept the fact that I'm going to die more. That doesn't mean that I'm not scared to die anymore. I still am. And of course, like, I'm still, especially like with what recently happened with the pandemic. I mean, I think everyone was like grieving their freedom and their fear for their life, right? Because I mean, early on when the outbreak happened, like, we weren't too sure how it spread. And even now too, there's still like, some controversy behind that.
So many questions still.
Yeah. Like, and now like with the, even though we've improved with the vaccination process, there's still like debate about the masks and all that, right? So, and again, that goes into the whole like uncertainty behind that situation. So yeah, so I think, and I'm not too sure about like how other cultures handle it, because I live in the United States, right? So in some other countries they handle it a bit differently. But yeah, I think in general though, I actually think it's a topic that should be addressed in school, because we learn about science, biology, and death is part of that, right? So I think we should normalize that discussion more. And one thing I am thankful for though is that like my parents, I have one other sibling, sister of mine, they sat me and my sister down and they kind of like explained, how to handle things if they were to pass on, right? So, and even my sister too, she has some arrangements. I also have discussed with my parents, in the event that I pass too. So we've had that discussion. And I think it's helpful to have that, just, because it's gonna happen. I mean, we don't know who's gonna die first, right?
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, but at least like we've had that discussion, and when it does happen, it's certainly gonna be difficult for whether I die before my parents or my parents die, or my sister dies, whoever dies first. But at least like we've had that discussion before, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't have that discussion. And when it happens, it complicates things. And in the case of like, people that are married and stuff like that, with like assets and things like that, it can complicate things if these discussions are not had beforehand, or if you have children also, right? Or in the context also of like, within the family unit, like, with your parents and things like that, if you have any siblings, it can complicate things if these discussions have not occurred because of, the legal implications and things of that nature. Yeah. Or even simply preparations, right? Like sometimes there's arguments about like, oh, like I don't think, mom would have wanted to be cremated or whatever, stuff like that, right? And again, in some cases it wasn't discussed, so people are just speculating.
Yeah, I think it's really losing somebody is hard enough without all of these extra things that come after a loss of somebody, whether it be the financial things that come out of it, the legal things, having to, I always thought it was very strange that when somebody died, there would be a funeral and then everybody would go back to the family of the person who died and they would like cater a meal to them.
Yeah.
I'm just like, what the fuck? That seems so backwards to me. That like these people just lost somebody and they're providing like a luncheon. Like what? I don't know. Just one of those weird like norms that I have absolutely no interest in. But yeah, like all of these things.
Right. Yeah. And even like if you look at like on that note, like the funeral service in general, for the most part, it's like, everyone's dressed in black, it's all gloomy and stuff, right? And it's like, it's, like depending on how you look at it, it's like you can either look at it as like, okay, we're here to mourn their death, or we're here to celebrate their life. Right.
And it's funny too. I mean, quite honestly, the biggest experience that I have recently, was my grandmother a few years back. I had lost my uncle like just a few months prior to that. And that was even harder, I would say, because there was alcoholism involved and he was only 50 years old and he, essentially committed suicide via alcohol. So like, but those are my two like recent experiences. And for all of this talk that they had in their very religious ceremony, that was all about celebrating their life. Like that wasn't really how it felt. I don't know. It's such a weird thing that like you're mourning the loss, but also being grateful for the time that you had. It's such a weird like crossroads of emotions.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I guess I think about the way that people talk about grief. The other experience that I have, and I did mention this on a personal note in my email to you, is that I want to know what you know, or what people that you've spoken to have in terms of preemptive grief. My mom has stage 4 cancer. It's terminal. She's had it since 2012. It's quite frankly remarkable that she's still alive today. And it's funny because she, in the last 2 years, has written 2 books that center around the subject of grief. One is a memoir about her experience with stage 4 cancer, and one is a novel that kind of was a way that she dealt with the loss of her parents. So it's also centered around grief. So all of that to kind of get at the fact that I think about grieving in advance a lot. What kind of experience do you have with working with people who had to do that? Because grieving for, I think it's 8 years now. It's a really long time to grieve something that is going to happen, but hasn't happened yet.
Right. So first off, I just want to say that, I'm not as experienced with that level of grief, but occasionally we do have people that attend that have dealt with it after the fact.
Sure.
So I'm mainly basing, my
Absolutely.
comments based off that, right? But having said that, yeah, I mean, I would say like, there's, as you mentioned, like you kind of like are expecting some sort of outcome, right? But there's still that uncertainty behind it, right? So on the one hand, like, I guess you're not dealing as much with like the element of surprise per se, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be any less painful, right?
Right.
And kind of like what we were talking about before about, like the breakup versus losing a partner to death. At the end of the day, you're still feeling pain, right? So I would say though, like what would happen sometimes, and again, this is going off what other people have told me.
Sure.
It's like many people also feel like a bit of a loss of identity when this happens, in terms of like, especially if they were actively involved in the caretaking role of the person that they were taking care of. So, for example, like one woman talked about how she was taking care of her mother, and then when her mother passed, she kind of felt kind of like lost in her life. Not, of course, because her mother passed, but also because for so much time she was, taking care of her mother, right?
Right.
So now that her mother had passed, like to some extent, and then also she also felt like a bit of guilt too, because she kind of felt like some relief in terms of like that she no longer has to like worry about it. But then also like that results in guilt, because she's like,
why do I feel this relief?
Right. That my mom died. Right. And it's like this double-edged sword. Right. So, things of that nature can occur. And I think it's, certainly normal, right, to feel that way. And then in other cases too, some people, that shift of role can unfortunately, lead them down a difficult path. Like this person is not from my group, but someone that I know, when they were also caretaking for their parent. And once their parent passed, like they had a bit of a breakdown. And I haven't, because I wasn't really like close to them. I kind of like knew them through a mutual friend, but last I heard, like, they weren't doing too good still. And basically like when their parent passed, like they kind of like lost it a bit, right? Because they just couldn't accept it. And like their whole world had shifted, because they were so used to being the caretaker. And when that changed, like, they kind of, like shifted into this mindset where, like trying to discover the meaning of life kind of thing, but taking it a little bit too far, I think. And, it's had a negative impact on their life, to say the least. Yeah.
I would go out on a limb and say grief is one of the most, if not the most, complex emotion that there is in humanity.
Yeah.
It is like, there's so many different facets of it. And, you talk about like the relief, and then the how identity is wrapped up in it. And I mean, grief is love, right? Like that's what it is. And sometimes it's hurt too.
Yeah.
You can grieve somebody that hurt you a lot. So it's so complex.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of want to talk about sex, the different sexes, because I know that you have a really strong focus on the fact that men have a difficult time because society has expectations of how men should treat emotions. So I kind of just want to like let you go and talk about that and what you've learned and how you work with men through that, and how the way that men and women, or people with penises and vaginas, how they grieve differently.
Right. So I would say the main difference lies, I think, in between like the expectations of society. And again, this is within the context of the United States, right?
Sure.
So yeah, I think still today, unfortunately, like we have this notion that, it's bad for men to be emotional, to show emotion, and that, they have to be strong. And, there's that concept of like, man up and whatever, right?
So
but
toxic.
I think, yeah. And I think when it comes to grief, like that's like the most damaging approach that you can take. And again, you have to go also by like what's natural to you, right? So some people are naturally, like, whether they're male or female, not very emotional, right? And then that's fine. So if if you happen to be a man or a woman, and that's who you are, that's fine. But if you're a man in particular, and you tend to be an emotional person, and you're suppressing that because of society's expectations, that's gonna impact you negatively, right?
Yeah.
Because in order to properly grieve, like, you have to feel these emotions, and you have to be willing to be vulnerable in order to heal, right? Like, you have to talk about it. And if you're not talking about it, and you're scared to, like, feel these emotions, and you keep suppressing them, it's your road to recovery is going to be a tough one, right? And in some cases, people will turn to other forms of help
coping,
that are not really help,
Mm-hmm.
like substances,
Yep.
or doing unhealthy things, right? To suppress that. And you might think it's working in the short term, but in the long term, it's not
More
going to help you.
damage.
Yeah, it's going to cause more, and it can result in other problems. All right?
Absolutely.
So I think for men, that's an issue. And yeah, generally in our meetings, like, we tend to have more women attend, but I have noticed, like, more men attending lately.
Good.
And they're pretty open, the ones that do come. And some of them are hesitant, like the first meeting, to share much, but by the second meeting, they're more comfortable, which I'm happy about.
That makes me so sad that these people are holding, like, such sadness inside of them. And I mean, the process is so much easier if, expressing the emotion is the first step, right? So
Right.
People who are able to do that have a leg up, I suppose, if you're looking at it that way. But it just makes me really sad that there are people who have trouble with, even that first step.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of it just comes down to, like, the way, like, we're raised, like, as, like, in school, like, if some guy cry, everyone would make fun of them and stuff like that, right? Whereas if, like, a girl was crying, it's just like, oh, it's just a girl being a girl, right?
Right.
And then the truth of the matter is, it's like, fuck that. It's just a human being, a human, right? Like, we
Absolutely.
all cry, like, it doesn't matter.
Absolutely. Yeah. How do you, I suspect that I know the answer to this, but, like, how do you try to coax them, or do you not? Do you just kind of let them be and hope that with time and with watching other people be vulnerable, they'll be more comfortable being vulnerable?
Right. So I think I take the approach of, like, lead by example, right? So
Sure.
since at least the meetings that I run, since I'm the one sharing, I guess they kind of see that, okay, like, this is a man too, right? And he's, like, pretty open about his situation. And I just, I'm very open about, like, stuff that also might, some people might feel uncomfortable sharing. So, for example, like, as far as, like, emotion is concerned, like, when I did the grief training, the first thing I did, like, the first session, I mean, we had to do some exercises, and during some of those exercises, like, I was triggered, right? So I, like, at one point I started crying, right? And most of the people attending that, actually, like, there was only, like, I believe, like, 3 males, the rest were women, right? So, right there also, you kind of see, like, that it's also, like, not a very male centric sphere,
Right.
also, right? But anyway, I was like, I started, like, tearing up a bit, right? And at first I was, like, kind of embarrassed, but then I was like, you know what, like, the hell with it, like, this is what I'm feeling, right? And you just have to be comfortable with it. So, like, I talk about stuff like that, and I think it just helps people, like, normalize it, right? And then also other attendees were also, like, some of the women there too were also triggered. And actually, I want to add that, this training thing was for people that were, like, in the profession already. Some of them were therapists.
Sure.
Some of them were nurses or doctors. So these are people that, like, are in the front lines of seeing people dying and stuff like that all the time. Right? And even they were, like, struggling with it, right? So imagine, like, the average person that's not, exposed to this or has no training, that it's for sure going to be difficult.
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I guess too, like, that leads me to another question that I had for you, which is, like, this work is so intense and probably so, I mean, not even probably, like, it is so emotionally draining. Like, what do you do to take care of yourself?
Right. So Usually what I try to do is like I try not to do more than one meeting a week. That way it gives me some time to like, reset. And I also can't really control like my emotions in terms of like the fact that, I might be triggered before a meeting or during a meeting, right? But I'm at a point where I'm more comfortable managing, any outbursts of grief. So sometimes, before a meeting, I might be feeling down, or even during a meeting, something might come up that might trigger me. But I try to, at this point, like I kind of have an idea of what makes me feel better or what could potentially trigger me. So I try to like manage it to the best of my ability. But yeah, like what I'll do is I'll just, like I try to like not do anything stressful before or after the meeting, just kind of like cool down. And then, and if I'm feeling really down, like I'm a big foodie, so maybe I'll like treat myself and go, eat something that I like or whatever, or just go for a walk or do something fun, like either that same day or the day after, just to like, recover from anything that I might be feeling. But yeah, I think also that brings me to the next point of like self-care, right? Like it's very important as when you're dealing with grief, whether, you're helping others deal with it or even with yourself. We have to just self-care in general, I think is important, right? But when it comes to grief, it could like really creep up on us, because I think in my opinion, at least, with when you're dealing with grief, it can also result in like, it can affect your health, right? Like some people will lose their appetite, their sleep. It can, affect your motivation, or even like your mind can like wander off, right? Which could be dangerous if you're like driving or doing anything or operating anything that, is potentially dangerous, right? So, you want to be mindful of that and try to like figure out like, okay, like, what can I do to cheer myself up, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's hard work and so important, whether you're grieving or like you said, you're helping people through their grief. And I ask a lot of therapists that question too, you're dealing with so many emotions of other people. How do you, take care of yourself through that? So it just occurred to me too, while you were talking, going back to like the difference between the sexes and how stereotypically men, have a harder time expressing these intense emotions just by nature of how society has shaped us. It kind of reminded me of, in the sense of breakups, how there's like a meme about this, but I think that it might be true, which is that like, and it's been true in my case too, that when I go through a breakup, I am devastated at first. And I really go through the steps of like fully grieving. I, cry, I eat the comfort food. I do a lot of self-care, a lot of bubble baths, a lot of journaling, a lot of therapy. Like I do a lot of that off the bat. And then like week by week, it gets easier until, 6 months later, I feel like I'm kind of fully recovered and ready to, get out there and date again. Whereas the partners that I've had, when we break up, they go out, they cope by, maybe going to the bar a lot, meeting new girls, taking them home, and they just kind of don't face it fully, or at least, I'm biased here because I'm the person in these relationships that are ending. But, and then, 6 months later, I get a text message that's just kind of like, hey, how's it going? Like, I really hope you're doing well. Or, in some cases, a guy like wants to see me again. So, it just is interesting how, and again, I don't know how this differs from like loss from a death versus loss of a breakup, but it's definitely something that I've noticed, that in the sense of breakups, the women in my life that I know have a tendency to really process from the get-go. And then really, they might hold some sadness still, but they are more or less good to go after a while. And it's kind of backwards for the men that they've dated, where I have this saying I say to my female friends, which is just like, they always come back. Like, I don't know. Like, what do you think about that? Is that something that you've seen be the case in like breakups that you've seen?
Yeah, so most of the people that attend for breakups tend to be women, so I don't have that much
Oh, okay.
data for men. But I would say though, I think
That kind of goes along with my theory anyway, I
yeah,
suppose.
yeah, but I would say just in general, like there's two types of people, right? And not necessarily like tied to any specific gender, but yeah, there's the people that take the time to, process the grief and like analyze what potentially went wrong in the relationship or in their self or whatever, or circumstances, and they go through the motions of, like let's say healthier grieving, right? And then there's people that, don't want to face the grief and kind of want to take shortcuts, right? And they can be male or female, and then likewise with the other approach too, right?
Sure,
yeah. And then ultimately, but those people again, like there's no shortcuts to grief, right?
Yep,
So
you gotta face it eventually,
right? So they're gonna come back, whether or maybe they don't, but they might try to like rebound back because they they try to take a shortcut and they figured out that it's not working, and they might feel lost now.
Want to have all those conversations that the other person had like 6 months ago.
yeah. So, I think generally that's what happens.
Yeah.
And I think even in you did another episode with someone where I can't remember the particular episode number, but they were discussing like an abusive relationship. It was this woman that got from an abuse,
B.
and then she
yes.
she had like a stalker and everything, right? Like her. So I mean, she didn't really talk about like her like, it was more about like how that guy was dealing with it, like his grief, right? But in some cases too, like from my personal experience, and then other people that not necessarily from my group or from my circle of friends, sometimes people break up from like bad relationships and they're still grieving it, right? So in my case, like my most recent breakup, like I'm still dealing with that. But even though like I wouldn't say it was an abusive relationship, but that for sure I felt like my partner wasn't treating me the best way at times. But it still hurt, and also there's that thing too where like, oh, whether you're the one that breaks up with them or you get broken up with, which is worse, which is better, right? That's also kind of bullshit at the end of the day, because you're still feeling pain, right? So yeah, even though I was the one that initiated the breakup, like it, I still felt pain, and it was a difficult decision to make, right? So, but again, like everyone, and then in my case too, like, my former partner handled it much differently than I did, right? And, at the end of the day, I hope that their approach works for them, and, what I did is what I felt would work for me, right?
Yeah, what you had to do.
Yeah. So, that's the way it is. But I think, and again, like this is not my realm of expertise with like relationship breakups, but I think generally though, I've found very little success stories of people that, try to just jump into other things and it works out for them. I think you gotta like grieve, right? And I mean, the only way I could see someone like, trying to move on right away and it working out for them is if they really didn't give a shit about that person.
Right.
Because that's the only like logical thing. As you said, like grief is love. So if you were in a relationship with a person, even if the love wasn't, like 100% there, like if you cared about them somewhat, like it's highly unlikely that you could just move on to something else and it working out for you. I have yet to come across someone that has pulled that off, right?
Yeah.
Not to say that, it's impossible, but I I highly doubt that. So I think in general, though, I think it's good at least to take, again, the timeline might be different. Some people might need a couple months. Maybe some people just need a few weeks or something, but definitely, I think there has to be some time in there where you have to kind of like reflect, and then you can move on to something else, and hopefully it works out for you.
In the context of like, a breakup, like there's a certain amount of looking back at what you and your partner did, rightly or wrongly, to get a sense of what you want to change in the next relationship that you get into.
Right.
Like otherwise, are you just going to keep repeating the same patterns over and over again?
Yeah.
So, and in that context, I think it's different. Obviously, it's different from, loss from a death. But still fascinating. Breakups have always been a fascinating topic to me, just the way that people handle them, and then what it's like to get back out there again. So yeah, just an interesting thought. But I guess like my last big question for you before we kind of get into you promoting yourself is what can we do as a society and as individual people to normalize the experience of grief and make it less taboo and be more supportive of one another as humans on this earth?
Yeah, so I think we should just, try to be more vulnerable when it comes to talking about grief and death, and accept that those two things are just, this is part of life, of the life cycle, right? In order to live, we must die. That's the truth of the matter. Right. And even when it comes to grief, I mean, even if you're like, some hardcore, independent person where you're like, fuck the world kind of thing, like you're gonna grieve your own life at some point too, right? So even if you don't care about anyone, right? So even your own mortality, like that's gonna come at you at some point too, right? And sometimes for some of us, when our time to die comes, we don't even know, right? It could be some freak accident or something like that.
Right.
But in other cases, for the most part, I would say, we're just gonna like grow old and start feeling that death is gonna come our way, right? So we'll have to have that conversation with ourselves for the most part. And then also one thing I want to add too, though, like another thing too, I think that's also normal, that should be more normalized, is just talking about like loneliness in general, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's also a big component of loss and grief, like especially when it comes to like the breakup process, right? Like some people, they kind of get upset when their former partner moves on, or even like say I always say like one of the main issues that can come up when someone like loses a partner to death versus a breakup is if, let's say, you break up with someone and then you jump into another relationship, you probably won't get as much, social backlash for that.
Sure. Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, well, all right, you broke up and the relationship didn't work out. But let's say like, your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, whatever dies, and then you decide to start dating someone right away, right? Like you might have backlash from their friends and family, like, oh, you didn't really love them or something like that, right? Because in that case, like the breakup, it wasn't like, it was because of death, right?
Right.
It wasn't because you guys weren't working out, right? And, I think we have to remember that, some people jump into things because they're because of loneliness. I mean, loneliness sucks too,
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, and even myself too. Like, even though I work in this field, and I'm pretty knowledgeable in grief and things like that. Like, I still struggle with that sometimes too, because like my cousin, he like I said, he was like a brother figure to me, right? And I confide in him a lot, and I do have other close friends, but it's not the same thing.
Sure.
And sometimes like I wish that he was still around, so like I could consult him about stuff. And right now with like the last relationship I had too, like I've tried to date again, and then it hasn't worked out too well. So at times I still struggle with loneliness, right? And that's normal. And I think having that conversation too is important, because a lot of people also are stuck in like toxic relationships because of the fear of loneliness.
Absolutely.
Right? Or when it comes to grief, like they unfortunately fall prey into people that are manipulative and will take advantage of the fact that they're lonely, right? And that happens sometimes too, unfortunately. Some people like they're grieving a loss and they meet someone, and that person is very manipulative, and like they'll love bomb the shit out of them, right? And they'll be like, oh, this is amazing, and turns out that person is horrible, right? So these are things we want to watch out for. But again, it's about having that conversation, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I think that's another topic that we're scared to talk about. The concept of dying alone, I think is also scary. So, but that in itself, like loneliness in itself, I feel it could be like its own topic, right? But I just wanted to sneak that in there, because I think it's important to talk about that as well alongside grief. And,
you're right. I never thought about the two as being so compatible, but they really are. They work together.
Right.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, you've given me a lot to think about there. Where can people find you on the internet? If there's somebody out there who is struggling with grief, where can they, sign up for a meeting? Go ahead and let us know where we can find you.
Yeah, so originally when I first started the group, we were actually meeting in person in New York City. But then when the whole COVID thing started, we actually transitioned online. And I decided to keep the meetings online through Zoom permanently for now.
Okay. Yeah.
And we actually have people from different cities joining us. So if you go to GriefX.com, so that's the word grief and then the letter X.com. You click on the link that says online support meeting. So right now we're using Meetup for RSVPs and such. So you can just join the New York City chapter, even if you don't live there. And, you can join the online meetings through Zoom like that. And then we do plan on resuming some of the in-person meetings, which will be a little bit different than the usual talk stuff. We'll probably do like some social stuff. And we also have chapters in some other nearby cities that I travel to where we will do some in-person stuff as well. But, for anyone listening that doesn't live anywhere near those cities, feel free to join us through Zoom through that link.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time and for, lending us your expertise on this topic. It's a tough one, right? But like we said at the beginning, everybody's going to have to deal with it in some way at some point. So it really does need to be talked about.
Yeah. And thank you for having me on, Rachel. And also for sharing your own grief. I mean, that's, leading by example as well.
That's I have no trouble being vulnerable. It's not a weak point of mine. Really thank you for your time. This has been Wine, Dine, and 69. I'm your host, Rachel Dalton, and let's keep talking.